So I'm here to talk about design systems for the rest of us, right? Let me introduce myself. I'm Sid, as you heard. I'm this complicated name on Twitter because Sid was taken. And that guy doesn't even use it, but he doesn't give it to me. It's a whole thing. I'm flying here from India, so like Kurta gang represent. So I work on the design system teams at Auth0, and I'm kind of super wired into the design system mode that I kind of tokenized I tokenized this presentation, so I have all of these conventions, and it's a problem now. Other than that, I work on a bunch of React stuff, like a JavaScript stuff, so if you've used any of my open source stuff, come say hi, I love that. And huge shout out to YLD. They kind of keep crediting me for this, but I actually didn't do anything. I was like, Greta asked me, we should do a conference, and I said, sounds like a good idea, let's do it, right? So huge shout out to Greta, who's kind of like consistently like, yeah. Like her persistence and weird enthusiasm is why this is happening. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Cool, so back at design systems at Auth0. So at Auth0 we have 120 developers and 14 designers, so it's not super huge, but it's also not like a tiny team anymore. And the design system teams is like 3 people. Like for the most part of the year, it's been just like 2 developers and 1 designer. So it's like a super tiny team, right? We really started small. So we didn't have dozens of developers or designers to actually work on the system. And most of the, I don't want to like, what do you say? I don't want to act someone, but most of the advice you read about design systems is like really good advice on what a final product would look like, right? So yeah, this is the right strategy, this is your 2-year-long roadmap, right? And it's really good advice, but it seems really scary and like not really approachable for someone with like 3 people and just starting out with like no clue of what we're doing. So I'm here to tell you that you probably don't need all of that, and you can make a bunch of mistakes and get away with it. And there are also some mistakes that you can't get away with, which I'll point out. So yeah, you just have to pick your battles wisely. So this is a Venn diagram of what a complete design system might look like. But you can, we looked at this and we said, okay, what are the few things that we can pick to get the most impact right away? And it kind of depends on the company culture or company structure. For example, these 2 design systems, Polaris is by Shopify, Atlaskit is by Atlassian, and they're like radically different design systems because of how the companies are structured, right? So for example, Shopify's design system is super predictable. It's like, it enforces a lot of consistency. You can't go wild with it, but which also means like the con is, it's kind of rigid, right? And that's probably by design. On the other hand, with Atlassian, which I don't know, has like thousands of developers and at least 20 products, they can't really have that consistent thing. So they have a design system which is easier to experiment with. It's more like a productivity while maintaining the consistency, but they can't actually enforce anyone to exactly follow things, which is super fair. So it kind of depends what kind of organization we are. And I really like this quote by Melvin Conway. He said, organizations that design systems, he's actually talking about like architectural systems, right? This is 1967, like nobody was talking design systems, but it looks cool. So organizations that build systems that are actually copy of their communication structure. And to me, this was super interesting because for me, a design system is mostly about the communication that happens between your designers, developers, your product people, your copy, right? It's not the actual code. It's the communication, it's how we all collaborate together. That's kind of the system. So then we looked at what's our strategy, like what's our culture, right? And we call this adoption-driven development, right? We're going to build for adoption, not really for perfection, right? And yeah, so I stole this slide like 5 minutes ago. It's like, okay. So design systems are for people, right? Like it's easy to say like a design system should be perfect, you should have all the tokens, it should support all the teams and all the platforms, because if your design system doesn't work for a team, is it really a design system? Like if everyone can't use it, then what's the point? But we kind of have to remember that you don't actually build for the devices, you build for the people who are going to use the system, right? And that's where I kind of say, we're going to double down on adoption. And so our strategy has been to systematize design decisions and then improve them later, right? So our V1 was basically focused on getting into products, into flagship product, and getting into production, right? We call this our Trojan horse strategy, that we don't change anything, we slyly get into production, And then we start kind of making all sorts of havoc. Oh, that sound, never mind. Yeah. And then we can change the colors, like make something accessible and it kind of spread across, start changing the font sizes, make it more bigger, and it kind of all works. And the idea of that is we want it to be consistent first and perfect second, right? So the short-term goal is consistency. It's getting into production and spreading the same thing. And then we start changing things. So the quality and productivity are the long-term goals, but right now we're like super small. Our focus is consistency. And it can get like a tiny bit frustrating because you're also absorbing some bad decisions. For example, a color that's not accessible, you have to systematize that as well. But you can flag it, like we do weird things where we say, this is the secondary color, this is the secondary alternate color, right? And it's called weird name because we know we're going to kill this one day, but it exists, so we have to appreciate it, and then we can change it later. Cool, so from the holy Venn diagram, these are the things we pick. So we pick tokens, components, design assets, and documentation. I'm going to quickly talk about all four of them. Tokens are not just variables. Tokens are, how I like to look at it, tokens are like decisions that should span across your product. So of course, you start with this simple thing. You say, these are my 50 shades of gray, these are my blues, these are my pinks, right? All of these are still variables, but then you start calling them names. So you say, these are my brand colors, right? And then even if your brand gets redesigned, you change the colors, but you don't change the names. So all of the products use the names and they get everything, right? Tokens. Tokens are awesome. When you get to the next level of this, where you actually start standardizing decisions, right? So you say, the success background is going to look like this. When you have a text which is success, it should have this success text label. This is what an error background would look like, right? And these are decisions. You can go further and say, these are the three types of shadows that we have, right? Like shallow one, there's like a super deep one, you maybe have an inset. And when you do color decisions, shadows, spacing, and typography, you're kind of, if you only do this, you get a very consistent feel out of it. In fact, if you had to do just one thing, do tokens, and that's like 90% of the impact that you get right away. The great part about tokens is that your technology stack doesn't really matter. So you can do them in CSS variables and then convert them into something else. You can do them in Sass, you can do them, so you can write them once and convert them for, like, generate the rest of them for everyone else. So what we do is we write them in JSON, because we do a CSS in JS. I'm going to talk about that, like a whole thing. And then we generate stylus variables for our stylus folks, and then XML for Android folks, and it's like everyone gets it, but we just write one. Second of this is components. So components are what your users, which are basically your users are developers who use the system. They probably use components 99% of the time. They don't really look under the hood or use tokens directly most of the time, right? So getting the API right is the most important thing here, right? What class names do you have? What are your React components called? What props do you use? That's kind of the most important thing, because you can refactor everything that's underneath it and people wouldn't really care. So this is like a tiny example that I really like. It's a React component called page header, where the title is dashboard. Now, you don't really know which H tag is this. Maybe it's H1, maybe it's H2. Developer doesn't care. What's the font size? What's the color? All of those design decisions are kind of baked into the component, and the user, the developer who writes this, doesn't even know or actually care. You can take this further when you say, this page header should also have actions. So I have two actions, I'm passing buttons, and I'm saying I want a primary button, I want a destructive button. Now, where do these buttons actually sit in the page? The right align, what's the margin between these two? All of these decisions are kind of hidden behind this component API. So getting this API is super important. And after this, we can go nuts. We can actually change everything in the internal design, and the developers don't actually have to care. So that's awesome. So to do these components right, we chose our base as React with style components, which is like a CSS and JS thing. It's kind of a big no-no in the design system world. And it's nothing against React or style components, but it's like these two technologies are kind of really high up the stack. So this is a slide from Harry Roberts. He gave it at Confront. He kind of says like this. It's like, these are the abstractions of the web, right? So the lowest abstraction changed the least. Like TCP/IP haven't changed ever, right? HTTP changed a little. We got HTTP2. URLs keep changing. You get domains, you get subdomains, you have new hashing stuff. HTML changes faster. CSS changes like, I don't know, once in 5 years, 10 years. And JS is this chaotic world that like, I don't know what's going on, right? So, and we kind of picked our components at the very top level, which is kind of like a bad idea, because what if the next product team wants to do Vue.js, right? Or wants to do Angular for some godforsaken reason. We're kind of toast, right? We can't really give them our stuff. And what about that legacy jQuery app that all of us have that lying around? Do we just say that's not supported by the system? That kind of doesn't sound very inclusive. And of course, like, because you're doing, even if you're doing a React component, underneath you can use the right, right class names, right? For example, we don't have to use CSS in JS. This could underneath render this, right? And I was thinking about what's the right abstraction layer for design systems. It probably looks something like this. So you have your brand, which doesn't change as much, right? Your brand goes through a redesign, I don't know, once in every 5 years. There are your tokens, which once you add them, you only improve them a little. You don't change all your tokens every day. Then you have the HTML and CSS classes. This is like a nice enough low abstraction. So you get your classes and your syntax right. And then you have React components, which should consume HTML, right? So this is like your framework layer. You can have Vue components, React components. And then you have the product where people go crazy and they change it every day, right? Products get features every week or whatever. So for us, because it's like our job is to support all of these people above by being like this tiny team, there is no way we could have got the abstraction right and also get it into production fast, right? Like, we could have built it the right way. It would have probably taken longer. People have lost interest, and maybe we'll never get in production, right? So our strategy was to kind of get into production, show everyone the value of doing design systems, and then when everyone likes it, then we say, cool, now everyone pause, we're going to do it right. So the good news is that our flagship product has this in production in like small amounts, so that's perfect. We were able to prove this works. Now everybody else wants it. So adoption-driven development, hooray. And now we can take time to go to the ideal structure. The bad news is nobody else can actually use it. So the marketing team builds microsites with HTML and CSS, and they said, this is cool, we want this. And we're like, sorry, can you move to React? They're like, no, we're not going to do that. And they're like, oh, okay, we're going to move to the right abstraction, then we give you. So we got our success, but we also kind of stalled ourselves. So it's like we optimize short-term adoption goals over long-term quality goals, right? So it's kind of slowed our long-term thing down for the benefit of the short term. And I'm kind of okay with that, right? Because, like, that was the goal of the system. It was, as I say, design systems are for the people. The people are already using it, and now we can improve it and give it to everyone. So that's awesome. Third thing I want to talk about is design assets, right? So the goal of a design system is to bring consistency, not only in like UI, but also in language that designers and developers talk about. So for example, the easiest thing to do is put your tokens in your UI tool, right? If you use Sketch, Figma, whatever you use, put your tokens there. And now the next time your designer wants to pick a color, doesn't pick up from his color picker, picks from one of these with the decision name. So that's like a quick win. A slightly more difficult thing to do is to get your components there as well. So, and the idea there is that if the components and the overrides are called the same thing, you stop talking in code or design, right? You don't say, let's use a button, and then you do a color picker, or you send like, I'm going to ping you a file on Slack and put it on Dropbox and all that. The conversation looks like this. It's like the design says, use a destructive button with the delete icon. It should say delete repository. And for the developer, this means I'm going to put a button component with the appearance destructive with the delete icon. It should say delete repository. Now this is super cool. You're talking in English. We didn't say spacing. We didn't say a hex code. Tokens, right? It's awesome. And for the designers, in the tools, it kind of looks like this, right? They pick stuff from the Sketch library. Yeah, they pick stuff from the Sketch library, and they say, I'm going to drop a destructive button, right? And cool. And for the play, and for the developers, they go to the docs of the, like we have React docs, so they pick the right props, and they say, I'm going to use destructive button, change the code. I'm going to copy and paste it into my code, and us developers are really good at copy pasting from other places, like we do that all the time. So this actually works. It's like a good workflow for everyone. And the benefits of this are twofold, right? There's a big productivity benefit that you don't have to think about, you're not kind of figuring out the basics all over again, you're kind of working with the decisions and building your features faster. That's awesome. The other angle is trust or authority. So the dev team kind of knows that whatever component comes from the system, this is already pre-approved by the design team, right? So they won't have to spend a lot of time in the review. So if they had to pick a component that's new versus that's something that already exists, they pick something that already exists from the system because it's faster to get to production, which of course everyone loves. So we played around with the idea of being able to generate a sketch library from our React components. We said code is the source of truth. We're going to generate sketch files. And we got to 80%. It was kind of decent. But the last mile was like very hard and filled with snakes. So we kind of couldn't get it to work and somebody had to manually fix it. So we kind of dropped that. So for now, somebody has to manually update the sketch library with every code release that we do. And to be honest, we don't do this all the time. We kind of do it once a month, like every couple releases we do this. But like a side note, we've been playing around with Figma for the last 2-3 days because we did that workshop. And it feels a lot more accessible with their API. So I'm going to try that out, see how far I can get. Cool. Fourth thing that we did was documentation. And this is kind of the only non-negotiable piece of the system. No matter how you slice that Venn diagram, you have to document it properly or it might as well not exist, right? If it doesn't, nobody can read it if it doesn't exist. So for me, documentation is actually the real product. The code and the sketch files are all like assets, like auxiliary resources. Documentation is the real product. And then the documentation, of course, should tell you how to use it, what this component is. But not only that, it should also guide you how to use the system, right? So for example, I really like buttons because it looks so simple, but then you have to write this whole copy that when should you use this button? Like what is a CTA button versus a primary button? You have to kind of write all of that down, and then button sizes, when do you use which size? You kind of have to guide people. So design guidelines, super important. Voice and tone is another thing that people should do. Our design guidelines are kind of spread across Google Docs and Dropbox. It's all over the place. We kind of have to get it to the right place. Voice and tone is super important. We don't really have concrete guidelines right now, but we're surviving, so it's okay, I guess. Accessibility guidelines, another important one. This is kind of a mortal sin, but our components are not really responsive or accessible. They're kind of bad, right? And we're probably going to hell for that because design system Jesus wouldn't agree. And of course, this is pretty terrible because if the building blocks are not responsive and accessible, your products can't be responsive and accessible either. We're kind of holding them back, right? So I'm not super proud of this decision because it hurts the real users, the people who use our products, even if the developers in between don't mind right now. Like they're okay to have these components, then say we're going to postpone accessibility, it's fine, but it's kind of bad. So the good part is HTML is responsive and accessible by default, so how much could we have broken it by? Maybe we can complete the implementation and then we say, this component is now responsive, upgrade your version, everybody gets it, so that's like a free stuff, everybody likes that. Accessibility is slightly more involved, you kind of need more input from the users, so we probably screwed ourselves there. And bad news is we're probably still going to hell, so yeah. So the moral of the story and the last thing I want to say is, don't feel like you have to follow all the advice you read on the internet, right? You don't have to do everything by the book. When you read any article, try to find out the context behind it and how it fits your use case and how much can you go by, right? So team size, like what's your team size, that kind of biases a lot of decisions. What's your company culture? Do you want a strict design system or a flexible design system, right? How many number of products do you have? That kind of plays a role. So do what works for your company, right? Don't try to feel like you have to create the perfect system on day one. You kind of do adoption-driven development. And know the trade-offs that you're making and try to pay them off in time. For example, right now, for the rest of the year, we're actually saying, we're going to stop developing more components and actually get all of those components to be accessible, and then we can kind of show our faces in conference a little that, okay, it doesn't suck, it's all right, we tried. Yeah, so that's like, pay them off in time is kind of the star, bold, highlighted thing there, right? And yeah. So I'm Siddharth. If you want to look at Cosmos, that's the design system. It's on auth0-cosmos, the now.sh. We're so beta that we don't have our own domain. We use now.sh, right? The code is all open source. You can look at how ugly the code is, but how pretty the docs are, right? You can look at the adoption. And if you want these slides or more about Cosmos, it's on my website /Design System London. Thank you.